Hello and welcome to another episode of Combat Analysis. Today we're looking at a couple of pub fight sequences from multiple matches. First up is a game on camp. I stay a bit out of reach to bait out a swing and feint into his recovery. Have to switch to the other guy here, but that doesn't really matter. This drag could have been a little more profound though. There was a small window here after my parry-induced recovery, where I could have taken initiative against a poleaxe with an axial slash. A chamber morph in response to the arming sword could have also achieved the same thing. I opt for a chamber feint to parry here since I sense that he's out-dragging me about halfway. And that leads into a nice counter drag on my part. This counter chamber caught me a bit off guard, but he did actually do a full combo feint after missing, which allowed for him to respond with either to my stab. None of that matters since I still barely outpace him, especially when he goes for the morph, then there's no question about it anymore. So here I push forward toward the barrels and try to help my friend. After this underhand, I could have continued the combo. That would have been a little more efficient. I could have hit either of the shield pairs pretty easily without parrying in between. I get pretty lucky with the kite shield player just taking all my blows here. If I had gotten parried, that would have made tracking them a lot harder. As far as movement gambles go, I think this is a pretty decent one. And generally speaking, I could probably benefit from practicing it a lot more. So I'm not gonna criticize it this time. Just bear in mind that the heater shield definitely had initiative there. If I had been fast enough to parry the arming sword as well, that probably would have been the best idea. Because in a pub like this, it's fairly unlikely that he feints, so that's not really something I have to account for. But going for the trade has some advantages as well. It's almost guaranteed to do damage, and in that case it also maintains my initiative for another potential hit. The reason why I took so much damage here is mostly because of the spear behind me, and had nothing to do with the trade itself. But as soon as he's dead, I start searching for the guy who hit me in the back. Because he misses with the long grip just before I find him, I get to land a free hit. And the drag that follows is almost full extension. I was pretty pleased with that. Here a chamber would have been very well placed. My stamina pool was completely full, while my HP was at a third, but I still went for the hard parry. That was pretty stupid. I also completely neglected to parry the spear, and only survived because he missed again. The reason why I spun around was because I felt the presence there. That move in isolation was completely valid, but I definitely should have responded to the spear first. That was by far the most immediate threat. Again I should have chambered instead of parrying, but because he misses again I finally get initiative. He falls for the feint and dies to the subsequent axle. Right about here I had the opportunity to land the first hit, but I waited too long before winding up, which forced me into a feint to parry. Here I'm kinda on the fence about who had the advantage, because I got a short recovery duration after my parry, but even though he missed me, he still hit the other two, which meant that he didn't get the slow combo. And while combo wind-up duration is documented, the non-damage dealing part of a riposte is not. And since the first attack in the combo was of that nature, the reference point is a little hard to determine. We can do a rough, and I mean very rough, estimate of where his release starts just from looking at the player model. And if we assume that the transition from wind-up happens here, then that's about 700 milliseconds after I return to neutral, which would imply that I could have hit him with an axle. But again, there's a lot of uncertainty involved, so don't bet your life on it. More so because of his movement than mine, I did manage to feint into his miss, and that turned out pretty well. Here I'm just alternating between axles and decels. Eventually he dies, and because the Zweihander runs so far forward before winding up, I managed to claim initiative with a combo, which is very nice. The reason why I felt like I had to parry here was that there was a high probability that the Zweihander would stop my attack, and then the maul wouldn't have gotten flinched, so I erred on the side of caution. That of course hampers my momentum a little bit, but let's not forget that, with respect to this knight, I still have initiative. Since I queued the parry during the strike which allowed for it to happen, the parry triggered in the same instance that he got flinched, and in the worst case, my total parry time is 1 second, which is equal to his recovery. And this statement is globally applicable, by the way. It doesn't depend on the weapon matchup at all. Now if someone triggers the miss detector during my parry, my recovery is even shorter, but otherwise the temporal initiative immediately afterwards will be determined by the weapon windup matchup, and in this case I have the faster weapon. But with all that said, the sheer amount of opponents around me means I'm not exactly looking to go into a turn cap situation, and at least I thought it made more sense to turn around and try to parry instead. Fortunately, they all hit me from one side, which makes the response that much easier. Also, the spear dies to a ballista shot, which definitely helped out. I continued to get fed a couple of attacks, which is awesome. A little slow on the parry here though. I think buffering in this situation is pretty good, as long as you're ready to feint to parry when necessary. At this point I just want to make sure I don't die stupidly, so I opt for the chamber feint to parry again. The ending is really weird, nothing I'd recommend to anybody else. If I had one up sooner as I was jumping in, it would have been more okay, but this is just stupid. Anyway, it works out and it sort of concludes that fight. I do end up dying shortly after. Brain shuts down a bit and I blunder a simple parry. I managed to retake initiative after that, which is good, but then I advance on the left again, even though the halberd is moving up on my right at a very high speed, and there's just no time for me to be able to parry that. Maybe I could have target switched to the halberd on the second swing. That probably would have landed if I managed to guide it past everyone else standing in the way. Anyway, I think we're ready to watch it in full speed and then move on to the next engagement. This one starts with a little backstab. Staying out of reach here against the maul guarantees a free hit, and that leads straight into the next matchup. Because he parries right after the chamber, just like I did at the end of the previous clip, he gets a short recovery phase, and that ensures I can land the next hit freely. I think I was trying to feint this strike, typically underhand drags are not so effective. Screwing that up prolongs the fight a little bit. But the chamber morph ultimately works out and he's finished off by his teammate. I spent a good amount of time trying to figure out if I could have hit first here. My recovery was short due to the leftmost guy's miss, but so was his, due to the ally hit stop. It did take him a while to land the hit after, but that was more so because of the drag and it could have potentially arrived even sooner, so I find it a little hard to say anything conclusive. But at this point, applying the same exact logic, I should have gone straight for another slash axle. It is the same situation but with switched roles. Now I ended up parrying both times instead, which probably surrendered more space than necessary. This time I finally tried to hit first, but that was based on a false assumption that I had just hit him. Turns out it was actually the guy behind him who took the blow and was put into recovery. If I had gone for a slash instead of a stab again, I probably would have made it. It was almost a tie anyway. I mean, look where my pike is on the frame before I get hit. But yeah, a little too slow. Since they both have initiative now, I opt for a double parry. The Fancy Knight misses, and the other guy is already winding up again, so I try for another double parry. And the same thing happens again. So at this point I'm thinking that he's just missing on purpose, and that I have to go for a gamble riposte to break the pattern. But then it turns out that on the third parry they attack at the same time. So the riposte is actually completely safe, which is nice. Here is a true gamble kick though. But since the Fancy Knight misses on purpose again, I'm still unharmed. Then they again attack at the same time, which is very fortunate. Here I'm trying to do something that is kinda smart, namely a little bit of edging. That usually catches newer players off guard, especially when you're cornered like this. And you can see that he's winding up a gamble right here. But then I get flinched from behind just as I'm about to hit him, which is very annoying. But I managed to step back, get another double parry, and then I ultimately achieve the same thing with a riposte stab instead, as he goes for another gamble stab. And with that I finally break out of the corner. This riposte is a little off the mark, but at least I am well and truly out of the tense situation by now. I was a little slow here too. I could have taken an initiative as soon as he feinted the first slash. I know I tried to chamber feint to parry here, but his strike landed right in between the two, so that was nicely done by him. Here I was anticipating a more feint, so that's why I chambered even though he'd already morphed, and that turned out even better than I had planned. Because he completely missed the attack, I could go for a feint into recovery, and as he was standing there completely open, his friend ran in to sacrifice himself. And with the help of a combo Axel right thereafter, I finally managed to finish off the Fancy Knight as well. The final engagement is also on Mountain Peak, but a completely different match. I bummed up on the horse a bit, should have started off due left and then made a sharp turn to the right and wound up a stab to try and force it to rear. Anyway, I did catch it shortly thereafter. I get gamble a bit here initially. His swing is north of 300 milliseconds later than mine, and even though the weapon is intrinsically faster, it's not enough to account for that. But I managed to parry without feinting twice, which is nice. Here I get gambled by the wax as well, and because I morphed the attack in the hope that he'll parry, we just end up clashing instead. But he parries right thereafter, and that unequivocally gives me the initiative again. Now I'm changing up the playstyle a little bit, because this opponent is very good. I'm pretty happy with the opening, as I managed to land the first hit. I waited too long after this miss to wind up myself though. It's kind of been a recurring issue throughout this episode. While it can be pretty effective against new players to just alternate between maximum Axel and Diesel all the time, against better players, the key really is to not have any pattern at all. So that's why I sometimes do the same swing manip over and over. This feint was far too excessive for me to have any chance of outpacing his chamber. I did actually try to parry eventually, but he did a good job accelerating it, so I failed. The only thing that really confused me in this fight was this part where he outpaced me with a miss combo, but there are three main reasons why that happened. Number one being that he dragged the first attack, which meant that my parry initiated very late, perhaps even later than it should have. And then I went for a stab, which is comparatively slow. And lastly, he did a good job of accelerating the second attack in the combo. It quite perfectly demonstrates why it's hard to make blanket statements about initiative. There are so many circumstantial factors that can flip it back and forth. But despite all of that, I do manage to clip him with another drag, and that concludes the little duel. So, back onto the objective. This guy starts with a spatial gamble, and then follows up with a slow combo temporal. If this had been an older patch, he would have hit me on the second attack, but thankfully, missing no longer goes completely unpunished. This part I think I played pretty badly. First off, I ran too close before winding up, so I burned a lot of stam feinting and then feinting to parry. This should probably be considered a movement gamble. I know he didn't actually reach me, but I cannot honestly say that that was evident beforehand. I was sort of hoping he would finally parry here though, when he swung out of reach, but that did not happen. Here I'm running left to get out of parry recovery before the hit lands. Now one of the problems with chambering in 1vx is how short the attacker's recovery gets. Even though I managed to stop both the axe and sword, by the time I land my counterattack, the war axe has had enough time to land another hit on me from behind. Thankfully you can hear him hitting the construction here, so I actually didn't take any damage, but I did feel very worried, and therefore went for a jump kick as soon as possible. After the clash I definitely should have sat back and parried the war axe. If I had, it's not unreasonable to think that I could have survived the whole thing, because by this time one of my allies had shown up and was starting to draw attention from the two behind me. Generally speaking, for this entire last sub-engagement, I positioned myself very badly. Right from the very beginning, when I ran too far forward before winding up, and then continued to draw the fight closer to the corner with every single move I made. Corners aren't all bad, there can be upsides to sitting in a corner, but this is probably the worst one in the game. Because it blocks your movement completely, but the enemy can still bang you on the head from 180 degrees. In a corner with proper walls, that ability is much more restricted. There were a number of times when I could have diverted the fight elsewhere, but the most glaring example is here, when I had already been cornered and gotten out, but decided to walk back into it yet again. Really stupid. I could have pushed up on the left flank instead. That would have made such a big difference. Thank you for watching this episode of Combat Analysis. If you liked it and want to see more of these, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, I'll see you all on the battlefield instead. Alright, Burkus out.